Everybody keeps moving further back. Everybody keeps moving further back. Or crane your neck, huh? Just one. I don't want to feel separated from everybody. Good evening. It is time for us to begin. If you'll open up your Bibles to John chapter 20 is where we are at. John chapter 20. And of course, we are still studying through the Gospel of John, and noticing last week we finished out the death and the burial of Jesus, and the ESV has this section entitled The Resurrection, and that's what we're going to talk about here this evening in the first several verses of John chapter 20. And of course, as we mentioned as the close of class last week, this is the good news. Really what it's all about. If it were not for what we're going to read starting now in chapter 20 verse 1, then there'd be no reason for us to be here. There were lots of people that declared themselves to be the Messiah, that declared themselves to be from God, that declared themselves to be a prophet, and they were put to death, and that was the end of all of that. But with Jesus, that was not the case. And of all of the religions in the world, all of the different faiths and theories and doctrines that are out there, of all those people that have begun any of those kind of movements, the one thing that makes Christianity different is that all of those who started those other religions and other doctrines are somewhere in a grave. But Jesus is not. And that's even the rationale that Peter used in Acts chapter 2, that very first gospel sermon. He told them, as much as you think of David, the man after God's own heart, maybe the most righteous man that you would, in your way of viewing them, a king and a prophet, David's in his tomb. The remains of his physical body are still in the ground. But Jesus is not. And that's really what the message of the apostles and prophets throughout the book of Acts and beyond, that was really what they were teaching. You know, we talked about Sunday mornings we're studying Acts in most of our adult classes, and from the beginning we pointed out that chapter 1 and verse 8 of Acts is really the outline of the book of Acts, that they would be, Jesus told the 11 at that point, that they would be His witnesses in Jerusalem, Judea, Samaria, and the uttermost parts of the world. The witnessing that they were going to do was about the fact that Jesus was not in the grave. And you know, we talk about the fact that they taught the death, burial, and resurrection as they went out throughout the world, and that's true to a certain extent. But if you really examine in the book of Acts what it was that they were teaching about the resurrection of Jesus, because that's what was different. That's what made the difference. And it was such a shocking thing. And we read about the resurrection, and you know, you can kind of hear the same thing over and over again, and it kind of becomes white noise. And then, you know, you don't really appreciate. We were at the surgical center down in Jackson today, and I texted Elizabeth. Elizabeth Pritchett's voice twin, if there is such a thing, is a nurse in Jackson. And, you know, you're hearing all these nurses give the same spiel to everybody that's in recovery about what you can't do and what you can do. And all of a sudden there was a different voice. It was a familiar voice. And Melody went, and Melody still, you know, she went, that sounds like Elizabeth Pritchett. And I said, it does sound like Elizabeth Pritchett. And I even walked around the wall to make sure she wasn't, you know, moonlighting down there as a nurse or something. It sounded just like her. Well, you hear something different and suddenly you pop up. And so like when Paul gets to Athens and he's on Mars Hill and he begins teaching about the resurrection, and all of those people, these studied, learned men, they're like, wait a minute, what, you're saying he came out of the grave? It was shocking. And it's not as shocking to us because we've grown up hearing about Jesus, probably as shocking as it should be to us, that He didn't stay in the grave. And there's been others that were raised miraculously by the power of God, But every one of those, Lazarus, we read about in John chapter 11 in this very gospel, every one of those that were raised from the dead, what happened to them eventually? They died again. In fact, I've always thought probably the saddest person in all of the book of John had to have been Lazarus. You know, everybody else is exciting, and Lazarus, in the Corey Standard Version at least, in my mind, I'm thinking he walked out and looked at Jesus and said, "What did you do that for?" You know, he was in paradise. But the resurrection is what's so important because it proves who Jesus is. Remember what two verses that we said you've got to get in order to get the book of John? We got lots of guests here tonight because of the holidays, so they won't know. So hometown folks really show out now. What's the two verses you got to know? All right, they didn't say it like they meant it, but they really did mean it. John 20, 30 through 31. John tells us what the purpose of this gospel is. Many other signs truly did Jesus, which are not in this book, but these are written. This is why I have written this gospel, is to tell you about these signs so that you might believe that Jesus is the Christ, and believing on Him have everlasting life. And that idea of Him being the Christ or the Messiah is what's called the book of signs, the first 12 chapters of the book. All of those different signs, that He's the bread of life, that He's the good shepherd, that He's the living water, all of those things were signs. They had a spiritual message behind them. But the sign of all signs was what the last third of the book was about. You don't want to say that, do you? Let me try that again. That's what this is really all about, that really proves who Jesus is. That is, that He is God. That He is, as chapter 1 said, He's in the beginning was the Word, and the Word became flesh, and that Word was the creator of everything. He's God. And the resurrection is what proves that. And beyond that, the resurrection is so important because, as we mentioned last week, one of the problems that we have living on this earth as human beings that we can't solve for ourselves is death. We're going to end up 6 foot in the ground. And what do? How do we solve that problem? Well, we can't on our own. But Jesus and the resurrection provides that for us. So, in verse 1, he begins, says, "Now on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene came to the tomb early while it was still dark and saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb." The first day of the week, it's literally the first of 7. The idea of, Sunday, of course, what we call it now, but the first day of the week was the day that Jesus was resurrected, and that's why, like in Acts chapter 20 and verse 7, when they gathered together on the first day of the week. It's whenever in Revelation, John talks about on the Lord's day, I was in the Spirit, and he had this revelation that the Lord's day, the first day of the week, was the day that was special, in which not only biblically can you see this, but in every ancient writer, the apostolic fathers, the church fathers, all of those ancient writings that go all the way back to the 2nd and 3rd centuries tell us that that's when they get. Now, they gather together at other times too, because they wanted to be together as much as they could. But the Lord's Day was the day that they gathered together and they remembered Jesus' death, and they were taking the Lord's Supper, and they honored Him and worshiped and those kinds of things, because the first day of the week was so important, and it's so important because of the resurrection. Now, he's introduces Mary Magdalene into this scene, and the other gospel accounts tell us there was more women than just Mary Magdalene that was there that went to the tomb. But John, as he writes this, is going to focus on 3 different individuals. He's going to talk about Mary Magdalene, and then later on he's going to talk about Peter and John, and those different responses that they would have. With Mary, she's going to come up with the wrong conclusion. When she sees an empty tomb, she's going to have the wrong idea of what has happened. Peter is going to see an empty tomb, and he's going to be perplexed. He's going to look at it and try to figure it out, and then just walk away kind of bumfuzzled. And I don't know if that's a proper English word, but it's a proper West Tennessee word anyway. He's bumfuzzled. He's perplexed about it. John, will see his reaction is when he sees the empty tomb, he believes. And those reactions are the reactions that every single person is going to have that hears about the resurrection of Jesus. In fact, when Paul preached on Mars Hill to those Grecians about the idea of a resurrected Jesus, it says that some mocked him. They made fun of him because this is ludicrous. How in the world could you say that somebody came out of the grave? That didn't happen. And some didn't exactly, they thought it was curious enough that they said, we'll come back and hear more about this later. But some believed, and it radically changed their lives. And for all of us, it's the same thing. We're going to have one of three reactions to Jesus. And everybody that we tell about Jesus is going to be one of those three reactions that we're going to see in these three characters. By the way, in John's Gospel, there have really been 10 characters that he's really focused on. I don't know how well you can see that now that I look at it, so I'll do it half at a time. Really 5 men, Nathanael, Nicodemus, the man born blind, Thomas, and Peter. We hadn't really seen Peter's yet, but we'll get over into the last chapter. But 5 different men have had significant interactions with Jesus, have had a conversation with Jesus. And most interestingly, there have been 5 women in John's Gospel that have had significant interactions or conversations with Jesus. The Samaritan woman, of course, in chapter 4, Mary of Bethany and Martha of Bethany whenever Jesus goes and their brother Lazarus has died. Mary Magdalene, which we're fixing to discuss in this text, and then Mary, the mother of Jesus, which really she had a couple of interesting conversations with him. One in John chapter 2, remember at the wedding at Cana, when she comes to him and tells him, we've run out of wine, and he says, what's that to me? My time's not yet come. And then the other conversation that he had of significance with her, we looked at last week in chapter 19, whenever he says, woman, behold your son, son, behold your woman, or your mother, rather. And so just interesting, the women's place in John and the significance that's placed on the fact that, as we talk about, probably not often enough, but Jesus came not just for one group of people, but red, yellow, black, and white, men and women, rich and poor, those that are popular, those that are not, those that are religious, those that have no religious background. He came for everyone. So she comes early in the morning, and that was a designation that they would use to talk about the fourth watch of the night, which would have been from 3 a.m. to 6 a.m. So very early in the morning is when she's come. It's still dark, so it's that early that she's come. And what exactly she came for, we're not exactly sure. What she thought she was going to be able to do down there, we're not exactly sure. But other gospel accounts tell us that the women had came to bringing spices and things, and maybe it was the fact that they were afraid that they were in such a hurry to get his body buried that it wasn't properly taken care of. But when she gets there, she sees the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And these large stones that they would use to seal up these tombs, they would put them in a channel that would run downhill. So a couple of guys, they typically would weigh, the ones that they've unearthed would typically weigh somewhere between 1,000 pounds to 3,000 pounds. But going downhill in this little channel, a couple of men could have rolled it over. Of course, Pilate gave them permission to seal it, which means that they would have put the wax and the Roman seal and had the soldiers there guarding it. But when you went to open it up, it would take several strong men to roll that back out of the way. And she gets there, it's not even light yet, and the tomb is open. And Mary Magdalene was one that, of course, had a special and interesting relationship with Jesus. We don't know exactly what sins that Jesus forgave her from. We do know that she had 7 demons, evil spirits within her, and I can only imagine that if she had 7 evil spirits, she was not living very close to a righteous lifestyle, as you can imagine. It's proposed by most people that maybe she was a prostitute. The text doesn't really tell us that, but there's lots of archaeological evidence that they've unearthed that Magdala, where she's from, which is where they get the name Mary Magdalene, was an area right on the Sea of Galilee that was known for the prostitution trade there. And so the assumption is that maybe she was a prostitute, but they don't know. By the way, though, I hate to always do this, but I can't help myself. All of those of y'all that have been to Israel, one of the cool things about that trip is when we go to Magdala, and they've unearthed. In fact, I would hate to be. I don't know. I'd hate to be in construction over in Israel, because the number of places that we went to where there's an archaeological dig, and the story would always start, well, they were going to build a hotel here, and then they found this. You know, it would be hard to start a project. Well, they was going to build this fancy hotel there where they thought Magdala was, and as they were digging down to pour the foundation, they unearthed the remains of a synagogue. And they came in, and they all of the people that do this kind of thing, by the evidence that they had, they dated it at least all the way back to the 1st century, which is an interesting and cool thing to think about, because, you know, the text tells us that Jesus preached and taught in all of the synagogues in that area. And if that's a synagogue that was there in the 1st century when he was there, to think about that Jesus was there in that place teaching is a pretty cool thing to think about. But that's found in Magdala. But Mary goes down to the tomb, and she finds the stone had been taken away from the tomb. And if I take 20 minutes on every verse, we'll be here all night. So I'm going to move ahead a little bit. But she ran and went to Simon Peter and the other disciple, the one whom Jesus loved, which is 2 designations that we've had for John. She runs to them and says to him, "They have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we do not know where they have laid him." Well, it was such a common thing, this idea of robbing graves back during the days of the Roman Empire, that it was actually the Roman Emperor Claudius that made it a capital crime. If you were caught opening up and stealing from a tomb, they would put you to death. And that might seem like a harsh penalty for grave robbing, but that's how bad the problem was. And so that's a reasonable, to some degree, conclusion. Now, she's wrong, as we've already said, but that's the conclusion. She saw an empty tomb, and her first thought is, somebody has broken open the grave and they've stolen the body. Again, a reasonable thought if you didn't know anything about Jesus and what he had taught. But that's what she says. And we don't know where they've laid him. We don't know what they've done with the body. Now, it would have been common for people to break into tombs and try to steal anything of value that they might find in the tomb, but there wasn't a lot of invasion of the body snatchers going on back then. So to steal a body, the only people really that would have had any interest in stealing the body would have been who? These disciples, not the Pharisees, but the Pharisees were concerned about that, remember? They were afraid that the disciples would come steal and say that he had been resurrected. They didn't do it. So she goes and says, somebody's stolen his body, and we don't know where it's at. And so when they heard that, Peter and John went out running to find out what was going on. Verse 3, so Peter went out with the other disciple, John, and they were going toward the tomb. Both of them were running together, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. And Peter and John, of course, we know there's a special relationship in that Peter and his brother Andrew and James and his brother John had a fishing operation that they were partners within. But even amongst that, you've got Peter, James, and John that were that close inner circle. I've often wondered what Andrew thought about that. But you got this close inner circle that got to see things like the Mount of Transfiguration that the other disciples didn't. But Peter and John, you'll notice, even in this gospel we've already seen, they must have, for whatever reason, had a close relationship with each other. You remember that when Jesus was arrested, John was able to get into the high priest, and he took Peter along with him. And here we see the two of them running together to go see the tomb. And later on, there's going to be a conversation that Jesus has with Peter, and John's there in the midst of all of that. So interesting that you see those two paired together so often. But John is recording this, and he includes this detail that the other Gospels do not. They both ran, and John beat him. Now, I don't know why John did that, but I think it's funny. I saw a little cartoon where John and Peter get to the tomb. Of course, John gets there first, and then Peter gets there, and he's out of breath, and he's like, John says, "Ha ha, I beat you." And Peter said, "Well, it don't matter. Nobody will ever know." And John went, So I'm not sure why that he put it, but it's inspired text, and he tells us twice in this text that I outrun him, and maybe most people consider him to be probably younger. Maybe that's why. But they get there to the tomb, and when they reach the tomb, John gets there first because he outran him. And stooping down to look in, he saw the linen clothes lying there, but he did not go in. Now remember, we talked about this with Lazarus, and we talked about it last week with the burial of Jesus, of how the Jewish customs of burying, they took that kind of pine tarry kind of consistency, sap, sticky stuff, and all these spices, and kind of like ice in a cake, and then wrapped all that linen cloth around them very tightly. And it would have been a messy, problematic thing. But when they get there, they find the linen cloths are still there. And then we're going to talk more about that in just a moment. But, what would be if you were going to steal the body, how long do you think it would take you to peel all of that off, clean all that up? I mean, if you were trying to break in and get out, what would you do? The equivalent would be like if you broke into my house to steal my TV tonight, and while you were stealing my TV, you knocked off a vase off of a table, and it hit the floor and crashed. And Jeff Wright, who's stealing my TV, says, "Well, I got to clean that up." And he goes and gets a broom and a dustpan, and he sweeps it up, and he puts it. Then he goes back and he gets the dust buster and all the little, and cleans all that up, tidies it. Now, would you do that, Jeff? Jeff said, "Yeah, Jeff probably would." He would also be in jail, of course, because if you're stealing, you want to get in and get out and get gone, right? It makes no sense. And it's one of those things the other thing that, there's two things that this really contradicts: the idea that the body was stolen, but there's another theory that has gone around for at least a few centuries, if not several centuries, called the swoon theory, that said that Jesus didn't really die on the cross, that he just kind of passed out, and then he woke up in the tomb, and he revived himself. Well, if the clothes the linen are folded neatly, you've got all that sappy stuff on them. There was no kind of like you see the mummies getting up and they're, he got up easily, and he took those cloths and folded them, put them there neatly. So both of those theories are shot with this idea. John looks in, and he saw the linen clothes there. Now, here's one of the things, I tell you this all the time. You don't have to know Greek to go to heaven. But sometimes when you do a little research and some digging, you find some nuggets that are there. And one of the problems that we have in translation, any translation, is that some languages have a lot of words, and you're translating into a language that just has one word, or vice versa. So like the example I always use is, I use the same word to describe the Tennessee Volunteers and barbecue sandwiches and my wife and my favorite pair of boots. I love them all. I don't love them in the same way, but it's just that one word. Well, in the Greek language, they had different words for love. And they had different words for Saul. And there's 3 different words that's going to be used for Saul. The first one here is what John did. The Greek word, I've got it written there if you care to know. It's blepo is what it is, but it just means to see with the eye or to notice. So he sees it, he's taking in the information, but that's basically all it is. It just means I saw, did somebody come through? Yeah, I saw somebody come through. Who was it? I don't know. I just saw somebody. That's the way that word is used. Okay? The second time that a saw word is used is down, what verse are we in here? Verse 6, and this is Peter, and the word that's used here is theero, and you can see that kind of sounds like it's the word from which we get our English word theater. And this word means to observe with sustained attention or to study carefully. When you go to the theater, you're paying close attention to what's going on the stage or the screen, right? You're not, unless it's, like a movie your wife has drug you to. But if it's a movie you're interested, you're trying to figure out, who done it or what's going on or what's the punchline if it's a comedy or whatever. Well, that's what Peter does. He's going to go in and he's going to study. He's looking at it to try to figure out what's going on. And then the third time that this word that Saul is used in our English translation, it's a word, E-I-D-O-N. It just means to see with comprehension or with understanding. So this one is to look at it and not just take in the information or to study it, but it's to really understand what's going on. So let me give you a few examples. If we were over at Mom and Daddy's and we were watching Star Wars and my mama walked through the living room and went back to the kitchen, you might say, what was on? And she might say Star Wars. And then you might say, well, what's the storyline there? Guess what my mama would say? I have no idea. I don't like that stuff, Then you've got, like my wife, because she loves me and the boys, she tries to watch Star Wars, and she's conked out on pain medicine right now, so I can talk about her all now. She'll try to watch Star Wars. Me and the boys love Melody, and we appreciate her trying, but we hate watching Star Wars with her because we wear out the pause button. She's just, wait. I thought that who is that guy? Where did they, and we have to go. So that's that second look. She's studying it, but she's not figuring anything out. And every time that me and the boys watch it, we're like, oh, I hadn't noticed that before. You see what I'm saying? That's the difference. It's see every time, but it's a different kind of seeing. Are you with me? Does that make sense? Well, all of these C's are used, and it's going to help us to understand why they come up with such different observations of what's going on. So he stops and looks in, and he just notices the linen cloths were there, but really didn't give it much thought about it. But he didn't go in. And then Simon Peter came, the second of our three witnesses that we're noticing here. He came in following him. He went into the tomb. He saw the linen clothes lying there and the face cloth, which had been on Jesus' head, not lying with the linen cloths, but folded up in a place by itself. And you may have seen a story on social media or the internet about the tradition of the Hebrew people and folding napkins and putting. It's a great story. There's no historical evidence that was ever a tradition, really. The word that's used here is really not like necessarily the idea of a napkin that you would use at the table, because most of the time they didn't really use napkins. They would wash their hands after they got through eating a meal. But nonetheless, it sounds good, but that's not really what he's trying to point us to here. He's trying to, again, help us to see that if you're stealing the body, you're not going to take the time to fold the towel and lay it over here on the side. If Jesus has swooned, he's not going to get up and fold the towel and put it up nice and neat, right? All of that, Simon's looking and he's investigating. He's saying, oh, wait a minute. John looks in and he sees the stuff there. Peter's investigating it, and he's looking around saying, oh, wait a minute. Here's the linen cloths folded over here, and here's the face towel folded over here. What's going on here? And he's not figuring it out, but he's trying to figure it out. And then the other disciple, John, who had reached the tomb first, here's our third witness. He also went, after Peter goes in, he's got the courage to walk into the tomb himself. He goes in and he saw, and this is the seeing with understanding. When John saw what had happened, he looked at the situation. He said, wait a minute. If somebody had stolen the body like Mary Magdalene thought, they wouldn't have taken the time to have folded all this up and put it neatly. Are you with me? And John says that can only mean one thing. He is risen. He's alive. And so when he understands that, the next word is, and believed. And one of the reasons that we're cutting off, not only for time, but we'll cut off at verse 18 tonight, is because this theme of seeing and believing is one that we're going to focus on in this next half of chapter 20, the idea of seeing and believing. But here's where he first introduces this idea of seeing and believing. When he sees Jesus, his body's not there, the evidence shows that his body wasn't stolen, that he didn't just swoon. They knew he was dead. John was there at the foot of the cross. He knew he was dead. Remember, we looked at 1 John chapter 1, the blood in the water came out. He knew he was dead. And if he was really dead, and he took the time to fold up nice and neat the towels, there's only one thing that could mean. He lives. And he believed. For as yet, up to this point, they didn't understand the Scripture that he must rise from the dead. Now remember in Luke chapter 24, verses 44 through 47, he said that Jesus had to explain the Old Testament passages to them, how that they all pointed to him. And maybe the Scripture is Psalm 16, and maybe it's Isaiah 53, and maybe it's a combination of the two, but they didn't get that. And you're thinking, how many times did Jesus tell them that? I don't know, a bunch. But they still wouldn't put it all together. But when John saw all of that, he said, now wait a minute. There's only one thing that could mean. And then the disciples went back to their homes. And I can only imagine what was going through their minds as they were going back to their homes. Where is he? We thought this was dead and over. Not just Jesus dead and over, but this movement was dead and over. Now what? Where did he go? Are we going to see him again? What does this mean for us? That idea of went, of course, is the past tense of go. That's an interesting study to do sometime in the Gospel of John about them going to Jesus and going to see him and going from him. And whenever Jesus gets right with them and tells them what's really going on, so many of them went away from him. And Jesus asked the disciples, will you go away also? And Peter says, to whom shall we go? You have the words of life. And eventually, in the next chapter, we're going to see that Peter, he's pretty down on himself, that I'm not much good at this disciple, apostle, teaching, prophet, student kind of stuff. So I'm going to go fishing. But Jesus says, I've got a plan for you to go and do something even greater than that. So then Mary stood weeping outside the tomb, it says in verse 11, and as she wept, she stooped to look into the tomb. Remember, she's wrong. She thinks somebody's stolen the body, and you can imagine how upsetting that would be for you to go to the cemetery and find that someone you love had been dug up out of the cemetery and their body was gone. That would be pretty upsetting, right? And in reality, we all know that person is not this, right? But that's the last contact that we have with that person. And so she's really upset, and she saw two angels in white. The other gospel accounts call them men, because that's what they're appearing as. They look like men. But they're angels in white, sitting where the body of Jesus had laid, one at the head and one at the feet. This is the only time in the Bible, by the way, that angels are talked about as being seated. I don't know what that means. I just know it's the only time it's said. Angels are in 34 books of the Bible, 17 Old Testament books, 17 New Testament books. And I heard a guy one time talk about it, and I never really thought about it, but he said the fact that there were two angels sitting on the end of this bench or table or area, he said, I can't help but think of the only other time in the Bible that's described with a bench with two angels at each end is what? The mercy seat on the Ark of the Covenant, where they would pour the blood of the Lamb to take away the sins of the people. And now the blood of the Lamb has been shed to take away the sins of the people. And so they ask her, woman, why are you weeping? Now that's a strange question. If you saw a woman at a cemetery, and she was crying, you probably wouldn't walk up and say, what are you crying for? You would assume why she's crying, right? But they have information that she doesn't have. So why are you weeping, she said to them. It's a question that Jesus is going to ask her in just a moment. She said to him, they've taken away my Lord, and I do not know where they have laid him. Having seen this, she turned around and saw Jesus standing, but she did not know that it was Jesus. So she hears these angels ask, why are you weeping? And she says, they've taken away my Lord. And she turns around and she sees a man, and this man asks her the same question, verse 15. Woman, why are you weeping? Who are you seeking? Are you seeking a king? Are you seeking a body? Are you seeking a risen Lord? How do you see Jesus? And she supposed him to be the gardener. Now you might ask yourself, why did she not recognize him? Well, there's lots of reasons, and I just listed a few here. Obviously I don't know the answer because the text didn't tell us, so the first answer is a question mark. But it was dark. That writing's not, so you may not can even see it. I don't know. But it was really dark. Remember, that's the first thing he said in chapter 20. Maybe she didn't see him, recognize him because it was so dark. Maybe it was because he looked different. You go to 1 Corinthians 15, and it talks a little bit about that idea of, the fact that he's a resurrected body is one of the ones I've got up there. Maybe he looked different because of the resurrected body, or maybe just looked different because the last place she saw him was up on the cross, and he was bleeding, and she wasn't expecting him to look okay, see, but he was. Whenever I worked at the monument shop, it would always tickle me whenever I would be out and about, and I'd have on my bibbed overalls and my cap and an old shirt and my old boots, and I'd been working, and I'd see people that had only seen me at church, and they'd walk by and I'd say, hey, and they'd go, hey. And I'd say, hey, it's me, Corey. What? Have you ever done that before? I didn't even recognize you. I've known you all my life. I didn't recognize you. Because you're out of the element. Maybe you looked a little different or whatever. Unexpected. You don't go to the cemetery expecting to find the person that you buried a few days before to be there. Maybe because of the tears in her eyes. Maybe she was miraculously kept from noticing who he was. You remember the two men on the road to Emmaus in chapter 24 of Luke? That's what it says about them, was that they were not allowed to see who Jesus was until he revealed it. We don't know why she didn't, but she didn't. And then Jesus said to her, Mary. And she turned and said to him in Aramaic, Rabboni, which means, the ESV says teacher, but the fact that it has an I on the end of it, that Aramaic term, means my teacher. Something about the way that he said Mary, maybe it was the tone of voice, or I don't know, but something about the way that he said Mary, she immediately knew it was Jesus. I think about like my daddy and how he says my name, or how my mama says my name, and it's different than most people would have said my name. I had a lot of people get on to me, but they got on them in a different kind of way, But I think it's interesting that how he revealed himself to her was not by what she could see. The way that he revealed himself to her was through a word, which makes me think about Romans chapter 10 and how that faith comes by hearing the Word of God. When she heard that word, she was wrong. But when she heard that word, totally changed her life. And Jesus said to her, do not cling to me, for I have not ascended to the Father, but go to my brothers and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and your Father, to my God and your God. He says, do not cling to me. The word that's translated cling is a word that means to fasten to. And we do that sometimes. We fasten ourselves to that body, to that grave. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Please don't misunderstand me. One of my early memories, and I hope I don't embarrass him because I love him and respect him. One of my early memories, my granddaddy died when I was in 4th grade, the original Gordon Sawyers. And it's the first funeral that I remember really being at, and really didn't understand what was going on until we were walking out the back of that church building and passing by the casket and seeing my daddy. It's the first time I remember seeing my daddy cry, and him leaning over in the casket and hugging the body of my granddaddy. And that was not the way that I'd seen my daddy before. My daddy was strong and bulletproof and Superman. We cling to that because that's the last connection that we have. And I've known of people that they deal with grief in all different kinds of ways. Some go to the cemetery every day or twice a day. Some never go back to the cemetery. And however you need to deal with your grief, I'm okay with. But I'm wanting us to understand that what Jesus is telling her here is the lesson for us that because of the resurrection of Jesus, that's not the end. That's not finality. He says, don't fasten yourself to me. I've got somewhere I'm going. I'm going to the Father. And he said that over and over in chapter 16, in chapter 14, chapter 7, chapter 8. He says, instead, go to my brothers. This is the first time that Jesus calls the apostles brothers. And there's all of these pronouns that he uses here, personal pronouns. My Father, your Father, my God, your God. There's a connection that they now have because they've gone through some suffering and seeing Jesus die. And suffering should bring us together in a closer relationship. And Mary Magdalene went and announced to the disciples, I have seen the Lord, and that he had said these things to her, and the things that he had said to her was, I'm ascending to my Father. She went and announced, I have seen the Lord, and that is really the first time the good news of the resurrection of Jesus that we have recorded was ever told by anybody to anybody else. And it was from a woman who potentially was a prostitute at one time, who definitely had 7 evil spirits in her, that no one would have considered to be a valuable witness. She couldn't testify in a court of law. But John says, here's an eyewitness to all of this. I'm writing these things so that you will believe that Jesus is the Messiah, and believing have life in Him. I am, Jesus said, the resurrection and the life. And it's because of the resurrection that the death of Jesus matters. It's because of the resurrection that the birth of Jesus matters. It's because of the resurrection that we're even here tonight. And as we said at the end of class last week, we'll repeat again this week, that resurrection is the reason why that when death comes into our lives, either with someone we love or even knocks at our own door, that if we're in Jesus, we don't have to worry about that anymore. So, pretty powerful 18 verses there. But we'll notice appearance number 2 is going to begin in verse 19, and that's Sunday night. If you've ever wondered why it's important to not miss a Sunday night service, you're going to find out. Well, what happens in a Sunday night service here in John chapter 20. So we'll pick up there next week. Those of you that are online, we appreciate you being with us tonight and hope that you will be able to be back with us in person soon. And as they get all that turned off in the back, we'll tell all of you that are here, we have a few announcements that we want to make you aware of before we dismiss. A reminder that